Why did humans evolve a sense of self? That's the question I asked Professor Thomas Metzinger in the following conversation. He's one of the world's greatest living philosophers, researchers, and authors on the topic of consciousness. He explains what philosophers actually mean when they say that the self doesn't exist. It's just a useful evolved fiction. I'm Shane Farnsworth, and this is the Escape Sapiens podcast, supported by the Andrea von Braun Foundation. If you like what I'm doing here, you can have a direct impact on the success of this program by liking, subscribing, and sharing. And now, here's Thomas Metzinger. I hope you enjoy.
Escape Sapiens.
In your book, Being No One, you say that the self doesn't exist. What do you mean precisely when you say that the self is a fiction?
Yeah, that's a good question, because fiction is actually from another academic discipline, from literary science or so. It's a term. One could say it is a misrepresentation that proved to be functionally adequate. Mm-hmm. We have many misrepresentations on the level of conscious experience, which are functionally adequate. For instance, we live in a world populated by colored objects. Physicists like you will tell us in front of your eyes there are no colors, right? There are wavelength mixtures, and there are metamers and all kinds of stuff. But then you find out that for some monkeys in Western Africa, to distinguish between what we call green and red was actually very good in evolution when foraging, to find out what are protein-rich fresh leaves and what are not, So we developed color vision. Most animals on the planet haven't. So that would be an example of something that isn't really there. It's not remission properties of surfaces. It's something much more complex. It's some reflection properties of object surfaces in normal conditions, and then it gets very complex to define that lead to a single quality. So that single quality of redness and greenness is in that sense a misrepresentation, because it represents something as real, which isn't, and something as a primitive, which is not a primitive outside in the physical world. A simple example, you can say we all have this phenomenon of color constancy. If you look at my t-shirt here, this burgundy red, and this will look all the same to you at noon, in the afternoon, and in the evening. From a physical perspective, the wavelength mixture that hits your retina is very different. That's a major computational achievement of the human brain, right? To always see this as burgundy in different environmental lighting conditions. So that's what I mean. We have developed many misrepresentations, strictly speaking, of the world, which were, in philosophers speak, functionally adequate. They helped us copy genes into the next generation. They helped us survive. They helped us find food, and so on and so forth. Part of the story I've been telling over the last 3 decades is that the sense of self is something like that too, like blueness or redness, that it is a useful fiction.
So I have a direct question here, though, which is that if we talk about focus, right? I might be driving in my car, I might be cooking, and while I'm doing these activities, I might be listening to a podcast, my mind might wander to be thinking about a calculation or whatever it is, right? My focus completely shifts away from the task at hand, but nevertheless, I still get to my destination, the eggs still get cooked, and the processes that I'm undertaking get
Most
completed.
of the time.
But so here's the question. You said that our bodies have evolved these notions of color because it's useful to orient ourselves in the world that we live. Right? We have some color contrast that allows us to see those berries, catch that prey, and so on. That's why we fabricate these things. But my question is, why do we fabricate this sense of self, this sort of first-person perspective, if we don't actually need it to cook those eggs and get to the destination? You see, I was able to, the calculational service works regardless of whether I'm paying attention or not.
Well, first of all, there are very interesting people who say, if you closely look, it's only there very rarely. It's an intermittent phenomenon. It's not stable. Then one should, of course, I'll go for your listeners, I'll go back 2 steps. So I have worked on the human self model for more than 30 years. There are 2 English books that sum it up. One is called Being No One with MIT Press, 20 years old. And there's an attempt at a popular science book called The Ego Tunnel, which summarizes a bit of this. And the general idea is that we are organisms which sometimes have a coherent model of themselves as a whole, which includes global properties, which only the organism as a whole possesses. I think there is a small partition in the human self model which is conscious sometimes, and there's a much larger region of the iceberg which is under the surface, so to speak, under the water surface. And of course, in dreamless deep sleep, there is no phenomenal self model. But of course, there will be an unconscious self model. For instance, the part, so if you look into the latest computational ideas, there's a young British philosopher by the name of George Dean who has very nicely distinguished. Let me go about this differently. So your conscious self model has very different layers: gut feelings, breath, body shape, motion sensations, weight sensations. That's the body model. That is a pretty good representation, I would claim. It's not so fictitious, because if that was bad, we wouldn't be here. That really pretty accurately tells you, should I pick a fight with this guy or rather not? Or if I'm a primate, given my body weight, can I jump to this branch at 12 yards high, or will I have no children if I try that? This kind of thing. So the body model is old and robust. And in the relevant properties, how fast can I run if I have to? How far can I jump? It's pretty accurate in most of us. But then there are higher levels. For instance, the emotional self model. I am feeling sad right now. I'm feeling lonely, And then there's, of course, what philosophers have mostly focused on is the cognitive self model, the thinking self, Sometimes it's mind wandering and dreaming. Sometimes it thinks about an equation and is really focused on something. And that creates an experience of agency sometimes. So would be a lot of things that could be said scientifically. I'm going to cut this short, but volitional motor control with a resistance and with prediction error, where you have to adapt the trajectory of your arm, that creates a sense of agency. And I think that's part of the sense of self. That's an important element. The sense of actively having selected a target, a goal, and say trying to reach it, but maybe having some difficulties and then getting it. Now we have this, according to my theory, on 2 very important higher levels. One is attention. Attention is what computational neuroscientists would call optimizing your precision expectations or precision control or something like this. And then they say things you would understand, which, but for philosophers, are difficult, like second order statistics, and stuff like this. So that has a lot to do with controlling the focus. Sometimes your focus is just distracted by external cues. But sometimes when you think about your equation, you hold your focus actively. And there's a sense of mental effort, I claim, going on with holding your attention. There's some resource that can be depleted. You can't do it infinitely. That sense of agency, in my writings, I have called this attentional agency, is a more subtle and even deeper root of the sense of self. And then there's cognitive agency. That's where philosophers have been going on about for centuries, is I am a thinking self, apparently, or they believe. When thinking about the equation and trying to find a solution, I'm somehow, what am I actually doing? Manipulating representations of abstract objects in some space, symbols, numbers, whatever. And that's a kind of very subtle action. And that also many people claim, other people would say, if you look there closely, it's not true, a sense of self, namely the thinking self. So you have something from the, so to speak, from the gut level up through the emotional level, through attention to cognition. The self model has many layers, and I haven't even mentioned social interaction layers, with two self models. Now, what I was going to say, this excellent young British philosopher George Dean has recently improved this idea by introducing a conceptual distinction, namely homeostatic control and allostatic control. The homeostatic control model is that what just keeps you alive, that your heartbeat, your body temperature, the oxygen amount in your blood, your breath is kept in very narrow windows, because we are systems physically. If we don't keep certain parameters in very tight windows, we cease to exist. So that's homeostasis. And there's a part of the self model, possibly the one on which everything is grounded in the upper brainstem, which is the life process itself, one might say, elementary bioregulation, something like that. But then we are, as opposed to many systems, we have an allostatic control model. We think about the future, and we think what we might do that we are not hungry in 3 days. Most animals cannot do this, or how we could keep warm and have a house in the next winter, months away. So we also, this has become very strong in creatures like us. We simulate possible futures. And of course, we simulate those in which we are healthy and have many offspring and everything's okay, So
this is actually exactly what I was wondering about, right? Because you said that we evolved the sense to differentiate colors in order to get this contrast. And so the question is, why do we have this sense of self? What is that? What is the analog of that contrast? And so I suppose the answer here in your model is being able to simulate the future. I would have imagined, so that is is that the kernel of the idea, that where simulation?
No, there are more levels, but I'll tell you a speculative story. What I think is a most important element, and that's the social dimension. When you were an infant, and I don't know, the buzzing, blooming confusion around you, you didn't understand the world, but there was one moving object, and that always came back, and you began to learn you can manipulate that object. If you cry, it
Mm.
comes and it feeds you. And that's the first complex object, mama. And it's an important task for you because she is your source of warmth and food to learn how to manipulate that object, to control it. So you develop of certain more complex moving objects in your environment, you develop a model of them as agents, as some entities that have goals and that can act and that can do something good to you, where you maybe can interact with them. So first, there was an outside social world as an infant that you constructed. Mama, daddy, maybe siblings. And you saw they were different than trees and chairs. And you labeled them selves, you know, independent agents, uh, goal-directed systems. And then you even realized something much more strange. They have unobservable states, probably. They have minds. Sometimes they're nice, sometimes they're not. Oftentimes they care for you, but this is not something you can observe with your senses. And in building a model of your social environment, you construct selves. And after a certain time, you import this and you begin to explain your own behavior in a selfie way, like I wanted to do this, and I have a goal, and I want this. I want her to come back, and then you import, so to speak, a representational strategy you have used for the social environment back into the construction of your own self model. And if you look, I mean, that's a whole different story. Self-model construction in infants and children. The first thing they have, they have these random arm movements. They have to calibrate their body movement. They have to understand where their body boundaries are. But after a certain time, they discover that it is them who is hungry, or feels bad, that this is located in this spatial body model somewhere, and that it has a negative balance. You don't want to be hungry. And of course, then they're in this interaction with mom and dad. So the sense of self, in an important sense, may have, that was your question, be necessary, or a necessary shortcut, or functionally adequate fiction to navigate social worlds, social environments. To say this world is populated by agents. And some of them are nice, and later every child learns some of them are not so nice. Some of them may also be dangerous, or you have to keep your distance. And that's, of course, good if you had to do what is sometimes called mind reading or theory of mind in cognitive science, to attribute invisible properties to some complex moving objects in your environment, like desires or beliefs. They want something, and that explodes, of course, into a lot of things, because there's this whole childhood development of theory of mind. If you understand that somebody else cannot read your own mind, if that's part of your model, and that they have beliefs, then this opens the whole world of deception. You can try to install a false belief in others, and then the whole social dynamics starts with all of this, trying to deceive each other, trying to understand each other. Like maybe I'm trying to have an accurate model of you right now, and you're trying to understand what kind of guy I am. And the idea of selves, and maybe also of rational agents or goal-directed agents, was just super useful for complex organisms like that. So we developed it. It was a fantastic strategy.
When you must teach a lot of students, a lot of philosophy students who
No,
are
no,
coming in.
I'm retired for 2 years.
No, but in your career you must have.
Yeah.
And so my question is this traumatic for some people to learn about? Because I know that when people talk about whether or not they have free will, and people learn that maybe they don't have free will, they sometimes have a crisis, right? To learn that they don't have any power over their decisions. But this is much, much deeper than that. It's not that you're not the one making the decision, but almost that you're not the one that's there to make the decision in the first place. What sort of reactions do you get to?
One has to be careful not. First of all, there are still many scientific facts which are unknown. We are not there. There's just this theory. There is a body, and the body clearly has something like high-level computational properties. Nobody has such a complex nervous system on this planet like we have. We have this cortex, and this cortex, I mean, these are real properties that other human beings have. And there is conscious experience. It's not that all of this is not true. It's rather, first of all, more modest. There's a certain metaphysical notion of self. Philosophers, there's a subdiscipline that's called metaphysics, speak of substances. A substance is something that we would say is ontologically self-subsistent, which means that it can hold itself in existence all by itself. So if your self was a substance in that sense, in principle, all of the rest of the physical universe could disappear and that self could still exist all by itself. So I think the notion of the self as a substance, that is out of the window. And I think even in a discipline like philosophy, probably 90% of my colleagues would say, yeah, but who believes in that? But then the question is, selfhood as a property, is it reducible? Then there's a long story. So the first thing I think that falls out of this, as I have said on page 1 of this book, Being No One, is the self is not a thing, but a process. It's a dynamic process, and to have conscious selfhood is sometimes something that happens sometimes. It happens during the waking hours. It is very different during REM sleep. The self model in the dream state is super unstable in many ways. And in dreamless deep sleep, you don't have one. But still, I don't want to avoid your question. There is basically some people who find this shocking because, in a certain sense, it's not something you can imagine. You cannot really imagine this to be true. Then there are other people who are ideological scientists who says, yeah, I always knew this, of course, there's nothing in there. And say, no problem at all, but have never properly thought about this, what this means. And then there is, for instance, a large audience, Buddhists and meditators, who say, yeah, but people have said this for at least 25 centuries on this planet, that there is no substantial self. There are major philosophical traditions of humankind who have always said this. There is nothing impermanent there. But of course, there is something there that changes over a lifetime, changes for minutes. And maybe I should add one detail to what you said. You've always asked about focus, right? Focus. And if you have a self model, and say you have a severe psychiatric or brain injury, and you have no attention anymore, you cannot focus on anything. Germany has just legalized cannabis last weekend, as you know, right? So the body model still prevails. I mean, somebody who loses attentional agency for some brain injury still has a body and the sense of ownership and emotions. But if you have, and that's an interesting thing, if you have attention, you can attend to the apple in front of you on the table, but you can also attend to different layers in your self model. You can attend to the sensation of hunger. You can attend to a sense of exhaustion, or you can very closely attend to that part of your cognitive self model with your example of the equation you're thinking about that is trying to, get something right somehow, make something coherent. So in the self model, there's something like a flashlight of attention that can go around and be on many different levels. And meditators are people who sometimes will try to make that flashlight of attention again and again just come to rest on, say, the breath sensations. To take the most classical example, on the sensory sensations below your nostrils. And just go back there whenever they have strayed or been distracted and try to reach a state where there's high precision, but gentleness, meaning no egoic sense of effortlessness, basically effortlessly with high precision being with some part of your body. And I think most animals can do this. It's a very unique property we can do. So one can look at this thing you often mention, focus, as something focus can wander in the self model, right? And maybe there are also parts when you self-deceive of your self model. I mean, you're an asshole. You have lied 3 times last week, but it's nothing the focus easily goes to. Or to take a more philosophical example, you will die. They told you. Human children usually have this insight between 8 and 10. At about 8 or 9 years old, I don't know if you remember when you first understood this, everybody dies. I actually cried a lot, and my parents, they were stupid, and they told me, yeah, but you're still young and it's far away. You don't have to cry. But of course, they didn't see the philosophical issue of mortality. Stupid people they were. And I thought it was very tragic. And that is something that is also a very important part of the human self model, I think, to come to something more philosophical, our need to deny our own mortality. And that comes back to your question. In the book, in the latest book, chapter 17, I have written
This is the elephant in the blind, or?
Yeah, I have written that mortality denial is actually a general computational principle of the brain. So it doesn't predict futures. It isn't supposed to predict, like when you're dead. It just simulates worlds where everything's okay, where it's healthy, where it has a lot of children. And now for those people who don't like it, that was your question. It's of course because it touches something very deep in them, an anxiety, a fear of death. And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. We should deeply respect this. And I am very suspicious of all these people who embrace something like this, like ideological scientists who say, yeah, it's cool. We all know this. This is the age of enlightenment. Yeah, it's all physics and we perish. I don't believe it. If people say this so easily, as if it is no problem for them, they already have their protective ideology, namely science and materialism. And I also don't really believe it if all these Western pop Buddhists come and say, yeah, cool, sure, we knew it all along. There's no self.
Mm.
And if you ask them, and did you have an argument for it, or did you just believe it? You know? And and then if you ask them, but you do believe in reincarnation, right? So what is migrating in reincarnation? Then they get nervous and then they have sexy little stories of some substrate consciousness that can migrate to another body.
Mm.
You know, even that's why I'm saying even classical Buddhists have a strategy of mortality denial, although they will tell you there is no self, you know, in the same sentence. So I think this has to be respected. And I have written many years ago, actually, that there is a great danger here. I call this the naturalist turn in the image of man. If anything of that, any variant of the story we have just been sketching is true, we have to face the fact that 80% of humankind living on this planet are firmly grounded in organized religion, religious belief systems, who in some way or another say there is an immortal soul and there is something substantial and there will be a resurrection of the dead, or there will be reincarnation. We are 8 billion people on the planet, you know, and maybe 80% of them are very firmly in some religious background assumptions of this kind. Now science comes along. It's not fun. It's very difficult for the majority of human beings because it will cause existential anxiety or something in them. And then I really stop talking and let you ask me another question. I think if we look, for instance, at fundamentalist Islamic cultures as an example, and if we look at suicide bombers and terrorism and everything like this, the West still hasn't understood what's going on. You know, people say, yeah, they don't like our way of living. No, they have another religious system where we are people who don't believe. You know, they don't like Western values. That's very superficial.
Hmm.
Our scientific worldview, which they can see on the internet, causes death anxiety in them. It causes a fear that their story about their religion and their heaven might actually not be true, right? And so it's completely natural to fight something that causes death anxiety in you. That's, so to speak, the non-superficial, how to say, deeper cause of the clash of cultures. You know, it's not just that they don't like American consumer capitalism. It hurts deep down. And I think even in countries like Australia or Germany, where now the number of non-believers is higher than the number of Catholics and Protestants taken together in Germany since 2 years. Even in Germany, of course, there are many people who will have at least a deep resentment against science. Yeah, all this. And why? Because they get the sense this may make my self-model disintegrate. If I attend to, you get it, right? Yeah.
It seems to me my self-model has to be robust to changes in my physical self, because I go through puberty, I get older, my body changes, I might lose an arm, let's say. And so whatever my self-model is, it needs to be fairly robust to changes in my body. And so it's very natural to develop a self-model which is resilient and robust to the extreme case where my body no longer exists.
Very good point. Yes.
I'd never thought about this before. So,
there must be one question, of course, to which I have no ready-made answer is, okay, given all these layers and the evolutionary history, what is the most invariant layer? in the human self model. What? Because I mean, I'm getting old now, and it's really funny, if your body becomes weaker, but you still have this 30, 35-year-old self model and are constantly disappointed and shocked by yourself that you can't do certain things anymore, energy wise, physical condition wise. But there's some part that just doesn't adapt, so there's even in what you describe over the lifetime, I think there's an element of delusion in there, that you are still as you were at 25 or 35 or something like this. But do you have an intuition? I mean, what's the most invariant part of your self model? What that has always
So
been?
I'm not sure I 100% understand. So what do you mean more precisely by the most invariant? Do you mean the bit that doesn't change through time?
According to experience, what is it that doesn't change? Because
as in, are you asking, just to be clear, I could ask you the question, am I the same person I was when I first came online as a baby? And are you asking, what is that element that remains fixed and is still me in the colloquial sense? Is that the question you're asking, or am I misunderstanding?
well, now you got me off on another side track because you used the concept of a person. Some people might say, yes, we have acquired a very high, in a Western society, we have acquired the concept of a person. Somebody has told you, you are, in a nutshell, a rational individual, and you have a dignity, and you live in a democratic society where you have the right to be respected as a person. Somebody might incorporate that into their self model and have this all over their life. They might think, okay, I'm paralyzed, I'm in a wheelchair, but I have the right to be treated as a person. I'm a person. But very obviously, in philosophy, there is a technical sub-discussion, conditions of personhood. So when I was an infant and couldn't control my attention and had no autobiographical memory, I probably didn't satisfy the conditions of personhood. When there's a certain degree of age-related cognitive decline and dementia, maybe I shouldn't vote anymore. Other people will make medical decisions for me. I will also not be treated as a person anymore. So one very interesting field we haven't touched is yet if there's an invariant part that is constituted by the society you live in, the larger social environment, and not the brain. But I was asking, with the phenomenology, you do have the feeling, in some sense, you were always the same guy, right? But you don't have the feeling you always had the same body, right? You don't have that.
Yeah.
And you don't have the feeling you always thought the same thoughts. Is that what gives you this feeling of being the same person, that you've had certain fundamental views that you have never changed? Is that it?
I suppose, getting back to the start of the discussion, when you said that, so you pointed out that maybe this sense of self, this first person conscious perspective onto reality, is formed for social reasons. So perhaps the fact that I'm always interacting with people and I have to make predictions about who that person is going to be in the future. So I'm mapping their behavior through time, and it's going to be the same sort of mechanism that I map onto myself. I'm throwing back what you taught me in this discussion. So I think that would be if this mapping is correct, that is perhaps the reason why I take the same mechanism and map it onto myself and see myself as being the same agent through time. I mean, I suppose at any point in time, all I have is my memories, which are just held on the hard drive somewhere, and I'm just accessing them in the moment.
They are not. They are recreated by every single retrieval process, and they are saved in a new context. So that's one of the frightening things if you look into memory research and the autobiographical self model, which is another important layer of representational content. It's not a hard disk. If you look at the scientific facts, you kind of retrieve an autobiographical memory in this social context when you need it. Yeah, we met 5 years ago, and then you fold it together again in that context, in a changed brain. And if you do this 1,000 times over the course of your lifetime, you don't know. This is not the original file from your hard disk anymore. It's different. And because the context has changed, it's like, I think, I'm just about to coin a very interesting new concept, autobiographical quicksand. You don't know if these are self-aggrandizing fantasies. In German we have this term of anglers of fisherman's Latin. So when they report about a pike or a fish they've caught, it gets a little bigger every time they report it. It just gets bigger all the time. And autobiographical memory is like that. But from what you said, I think that a very natural empirical prediction falls out. If you would throw somebody out on a lonely island and deprive them from all social interactions for decades, or if you put them in solitary confinement and minimize interactions to an absolute nothing, just food falling in, their self-model should disintegrate. Their sense of self should disintegrate. And if in addition you would poison the food of your tortured prisoner in solitary confinement with a drug that deletes all autobiographical memory, the sense of self would probably become very weak. I think that's the empirical prediction from what you said, and I think it's quite plausible. I think maybe the core in a normal life is the recurring sense of being in control. So if you don't die, and if you don't have a serious psychiatric condition like schizophrenia, but you live a so-called normal life, there is a sense of control over your bodily actions, over your focus of attention, and over your thoughts that goes up and down. We don't like loss of control. We hate it. But there is a sense of, control that surfaces often enough to create a control model, a model of an entity that is in control. And I don't know if that helps you, but
I think it does. So what you're saying is your self-model, whatever it is, to be a successful self-model, it has to involve dynamics.
Yes,
in some sense.
We are dynamical systems.
And so in some sense, it's like the smallest, I don't know what the smallest conscious state is or the smallest nugget of consciousness is, but whatever it is, it has to involve dynamics, otherwise it's not useful. So that could be an element that you incorporate into your minimal model of consciousness.
I don't know. There could be, of course there's neural dynamics, no question about it, but we have contents that stay constant. So, but not for a long time. So maybe interesting example is the Ganzfeld effect. If you fill the whole visual field of a subject just with a homogeneous red, there's nothing but you can see red in a lab. Some people, after a few seconds, turn blind. Technically speaking, they say the visual field desaturates. Some people just say, see a milky fog. So it's not possible in this dynamic environment of the brain to hold a single phenomenal property, just redness, stable in a whole visual field. It goes for some time, but I don't know, after 90 seconds or so, everybody doesn't see red anymore, although nothing has changed on the retina physically. That tells you that there are very complex dynamic mechanisms behind all of this. But as you said, conscious experience, I mean, on the level of conscious experience, we do have the experience of constancy or stability. I mean, some things stay the same. But yeah, but that's, you see, to come back to meditators. Meditators say, don't talk as you have been taught to talk in describing yourself, but just look what is there, mindfulness, attend to your own thought processes. And then you will see that the whole thing is much more dynamic than you ever thought, that everybody told you. It's a constantly fluctuating landscape with distractions and loss of attention all the time, and we describe it in a certain sense. The word self-model is already false because it introduces an entity, a thing-like entity. It reifies it into as if there was an abstract object, the self-model. But in reality, there is just the process of dynamical self-modeling, the dynamics of conscious self-modeling. And we talk in this society, in this culture, as if there was something stable there. We also don't want others to know how unstable we actually are.
Okay, so there's something that you keep touching on, which is,
yes.
So you touch on these two different ideas. You mention on one side the practice of meditation, but on the other side you mention sort of empirical experiment, right? Because I can do a self-experiment in my own head, and I can think, and I can learn to meditate, but then I can just tell you about what my experience is. So when it comes to being rigorous and nailing down what we can actually measure and do an experiment, when it comes to making a hypothesis and going and testing, how rigorous can we be when it comes to the study of consciousness? What experiments are you actually able to do in the lab which really pull apart different models and say that theory of mind makes more sense than this one, or this is our standard model of consciousness, this is the kernel of what we know is true, not just because I feel it, but because I can go away and I can test. Let me give you an example. I can test that my dog has a sense of self, or something like this. I mean, like, not a people will complain that if all you rely on is meditation, then
no, absolutely not.
I know this isn't the case for yourself, but people will wonder, is there anything outside of, I'm saying this with complete respect, woo-woo or something like this? The people will be interested in the actual sort of nail in the fabric of reality. What can you say through experiment?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of good meditation research, but a first thing you said, so I don't know how to start. There is a well-established scientific discipline which is called psychophysics, which exists for a long time, where you just look at very carefully your visuals, you vary stimulus conditions, and you see what people can report and at what stage they cannot report anything anymore. And that's one thing. If you look at MI3 Press, I have in 2000 edited a large collection called Neurocorrelates of Consciousness, where I organized a big conference in Bremen, Germany in 1998 with 400 people. And for 20 years, people have tried to find out the minimally sufficient neurocorrelate for consciousness or for specific things, for redness experiences or so. We do have a lot of data. Now, recently, in 1994, we founded this society, the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. It has become very political because there are some people who push their own theory, large labs, and it's a bit confusing for lay people. But there are some proposals on the table. And the gold standard is, of course, being able to predict the occurrence of conscious experiences. And there are many examples. I mean, people just have to acknowledge this. I'll just give you two examples. Derrida in, what was that, 2002 or 6, with an electrode in the brain. I did some research. I cooperated with neuroscientists on out-of-body experiences. What most people who think about soul travel and astral bodies don't know is that out-of-body experiences have been caused by electrodes with an electrode in the brain, reliably. That somebody will say, now I'm out of my body, now I'm in my body. Now I'm out of my body, now I'm in my body. That's a 40 millivolt, very local physical event. This is part of the database, things. I give you another example.
Could I ask about that? Sorry, that's really interesting. So you would have someone behind the controls who would decide when they're flipping the switch, and the person would say, no, now I'm disassociating from my first person view, I'm out of my body, floating over myself, or whatever the measured or the experience. So this is how the experiments run?
Well, the thing is, of course, you don't do this like this. Some epileptics, before they undergo surgery, need to have done some testing for what are sensitive regions that may not be damaged. And some epileptics also have out-of-body experiences. And so if they give consent, sometimes you can do scientific experiments while probing with an electrode. Nobody would do this in a healthy person. But yeah, and you just take the current off. I think I have described this in the ego tunnel, or maybe also in Being No One. You take the current off and it's you're locked into the perspective again. You turn the current on. Another example that is much more interesting, people on psychedelics or in meditation sometimes have deep experiences of insight, of knowing with great certainty. There are people in Geneva in epileptology who have also caused states like this in epileptic patients with an electrode. Dostoevsky has written about it. So even something more subtle as the experience of suddenly knowing with great certainty can be reliably, I mean, of course, you can't repeat this on a large scale for obvious reasons because you don't have so many patients, but this safe evidence that this can be reliably caused by a very local physical event, repeatable, the experience of knowing. And these are two examples of building blocks where, we know a lot, of the relationship between local events in the brain. You may know that I've been for a certain time involved with Olaf Blanke's lab, and we were trying to create out-of-body experiences in the lab with virtual reality. This is slow, but it gets better and it gets better, and there are very cool young people at it, you know.
This is the experiment where you have the VR headset and someone is stroked on their back and they visualize themselves in front of. Could you
Yeah.
explain maybe the rubber hand experiment? This is something that you talk about as well, and you
Yeah.
write
So
about.
everybody knows the rubber hand experiment. You see a mannequin's hand, but not your own. You feel how your own hand is stroked, and you see how the rubber hand is stroked. And if they are stroked in synchrony, the brain makes a prediction that it visually sees there is a touching on the mannequin's hand in the right angle to your elbow, in certain conditions, and it gets a tactile cortex, it gets a tactile stimulus, and there is temporal synchrony, and it just ascribes this to the same cause and location. And then the body model changes, right? The body model changes and say, I can actually feel how I'm being touched in this plastic hand, where I know cognitively this is a plastic hand. By now, this is a classic experiment by Botvinnik and Cohen. There are probably 125 variations of this experiment. You can do it also without a hand, just with the surface of the desk, for instance. And in the old times, I gave a talk and I went to these neuroscientists and said, for philosophical reasons, I don't have a lab. I want a whole body variant of the rubber hand illusion. And then they said, this is only philosophers can talk that kind of bullshit. The brain never sees it's the body from the outside, could never. And then I said, wait a minute. We have a virtual reality lab. Maybe we can try. And then Binja Lengenhager, Swiss neuroscientist, that's that famous science paper of 2007, created this experience, just as you describe. You wear a headset, a camera is filming you from behind, that picture is inserted into virtual reality in front of you. And while your back gets stroked, you see your back being stroked. And it is only a small number of subjects. I don't know where they are now. You can vary conditions in many, many ways. They're doing very clever technical setups now. I only ever got what is technically called drift. Like immediately you feel a strong pull to the phantom body in front of you in virtual reality. You feel, and you can measure if you're supposed to say how long the distance was. People miscalculate the distance between the phantom body and their so-called physical bodies, both self-models. It's actually more complicated. And so I never, in these experiments, got into a state of full identification with the avatar. But some people apparently do, and you get psychophysically measurable effects, of drifts, of proximity. And so the brain does integrate them too. And I think a very good step forward, I think they're getting better and better and better now, also with auditory stimuli. But a very intelligent design was done by a British psychologist, Jane Aspel. I really liked that experiment. She had this idea first, is a cardiovisual illusion. So like record your heartbeat and make the avatar standing in front of you have a yellow glow around it that pulsates in your heartbeat. If it's asynchronous, nothing much happens. But if it pulsates in the same rhythm, which you probably don't even consciously experience in your own body, then identification becomes very strong. Cardiovisual synchrony. And, of course, there's now an industry, and as I'm working in other fields, I don't know, there's a patent. Olaf and his colleagues have made a patent for creating out-of-body experiences. So these are examples of of how we will, of course, in the future be able to change the content of our self models in better and better a way. And now just imagine the confluence of the two fields of AI and virtual reality, which is also getting better, in presenting stimuli to the human brain. I think if we don't kill ourselves first on the on the planet, there are some really exciting developments in terms of, you can, for instance, just when you identify with an avatar, you can, of course, also quickly shift the perspective into the perspective of the avatar and see what that does. See out of its eyes, and so on, and so on. And you can have a virtual reality with many features like I have done in Mel Slater's lab in Barcelona. You can put a heater in front of your back or to your left and simulate a crackling fireplace and get warmth on your body. And you can make it very realistic. You can, in virtual reality, you can have mirrors where you can look inside a mirror. And if this is done well, visually well, high density, and we're getting there, you might have the feeling that's what in the original world, they call this the place illusion. You have the feeling you're really there, really, really there. And that's, of course, all self-model science. That's all the stuff I've been talking about for 30 years.
See, what I find exciting is, for all of human history, we've been able to, say, meditate and do these practices to learn more about ourselves. But right now we're in a fairly special time, right? Because we have the technology, we have the computation to be able to dig deeper in some sense and ask questions that we could never ask before. And so, for instance, at the start of our discussion, you were talking about where the sense of a self model comes from. A young baby, for instance, may not have a sense of self to start with, but as they start empathizing or start trying to manipulate their mother, they develop this concept of agents in the world, and then they map it onto themselves. So right now it's fairly topical to talk about, we'll ask the question, let's say we construct an AI, how will we know that this AI also has a self model, has this sort of first person perspective, whether it suffers, questions like this. Is there a set, or are there a suite of tests that we can do? Have people designed tests to determine that agent there really does have this same sort of conceptual of the world?
The short answer is no. There's ongoing discussion about. The interesting question is, because we're getting into hot territory there. And of course, footnote, robots that have self-models have existed for a long time. There's good work. Of course, for roboticists, this whole story I have been telling for years is mildly interesting, and they're doing it all the time because of intelligent adaptive control. At a certain time, these systems need an online body model, and a better one. So we do have machines with self-models. The question is, do we have machines with phenomenal self-models? I do hope not. And the historical situations, as you may know, I have officially called for a moratorium on synthetic phenomenology 2 years ago. I've written a paper because I think it scares me that there are 4 labs on the world right now, really esteemed colleagues, people I take very seriously, who do good research, who said, if we can make artificial consciousness, we're going to do it. And I think we should be very, very careful there, to make a long story short, because we could cause a lot of suffering. And we shouldn't there's an open access paper out there where I say a bit about the conditions that an artificial system would have to satisfy to be able to suffer. And we shouldn't even go there. I think we shouldn't even risk it. But of course, in this world, I'm not naive. Nobody will care. We also don't care how we treat animals in factory farming, and we punish our own children. Nobody will hesitate to make machines suffer if they can do it. But the question is, we have these 4 or 5 grand theories on the table. In the consciousness community, we don't know what it is. And the big question some people are discussing now, given that little bit we know, could we develop some kinds of, rule of thumb tests, which is also very interesting, not only for AI, but also for animal ethics. I mean, we need to know. I'll tell you a personal concrete example. My first religion was fishing. When I was a little boy and youth, I loved to go fishing, 4 a.m. in the morning, and I killed many, many fish. And now I'm a vegetarian, vegan, even for 45 years on ethical grounds, and I'm very sorry to what I did to fish. But the scientific question, of course, is, do fish have a phenomenal self-model? If just think of these large ships where hundreds of thousands of fish choke to death and are pressed to death in these large fishing nets. I would never eat fish, but do they really have a phenomenal self-model? That's a very important scientific question. If somebody could conclusively show me that fish do not have a phenomenal self-model, never. I would immediately go fishing again, because I like it and I like the taste of fish, because that's the necessary condition of suffering. And you live in Berlin. I was very disappointed when I went to a conference about fish consciousness in Berlin a few years ago, and there were all these fish experts, and I asked them, so do you think do you? And they were just very dry and said, there are 30,000 different kinds of fish. They don't like global questions like, do you think fish have a phenomenal self-model? In their universe, it would be which kind of fish? And of course, nothing is known. So I think we don't really know. But I'll give you an example. So the oldest theory of consciousness in modern times is Bernard Bahr's 1988 global workspace theory, which basically says the content of consciousness is the content of a global workspace where many processes in the brain continuously compete to be in that global workspace, and that content gets broadcast to everywhere else, and whatever is content of this global workspace is the content of consciousness. And there are refinements on this. There is a good amount of neuroscientific evidence on this. If that were true, I think one could still have conscious artificial systems with a global workspace under that description. There's a technical description in which the lights are on as long as there's nobody there, as long as there is only a phenomenal world model, but not a phenomenal self model. This would still be okay, I think, from an ethical perspective, but it's of course naive, because every system that's so intelligent that it controls its own cognitive operations or interacts with human users or has to control a robot body will practically inevitably, I think, develop a self-model.
This is why I asked at the beginning, way back at the beginning, why it is that we have self-models if I can drive my car and get to the destination without focusing. Because I was wondering whether it would ultimately be possible to construct an AI which either one, doesn't have a self-model, or two, doesn't suffer.
That's a very good question. And I think it's not, because a lot of empirical, um, if you we don't have a theory of consciousness, but a lot of data point to the result that conscious processing enhances the selectivity, the adaptivity, and the flexibility of an organism's behavioral profile. So you can have a shower or drive your car and you have these unconscious motor routines and it all works. But the moment anything that there's a high prediction error ascending in the hierarchy, your phenomenal self model is there, if somebody does something wrong in traffic. So it can always come online. And the thought experiment would be, I think, that corresponds to your question, is somnambulism, sleepwalkers. A sleepwalker is a human being that walks around in the house, has complex motor control, and is completely unconscious, right? But what we know is that they are very schematic in their motions, and sleepwalkers do hurt themselves. It's as far as I know, it's not like in the folklore. A sleepwalker may fall down the stairs or from a roof, as is the standard example, always. So what is the sleepwalker? Healthy human body without consciousness, what are they lacking? And I think they lack context sensitivity. And for that reason, they also lack exactly those things I have just mentioned. They lack the adaptivity of the behavioral profile, the selectivity in motor control. It's narrowed down. So I think zombie human beings, in that sense, sleepwalkers probably couldn't do science and couldn't participate in complex traffic. And there's very clearly something there. There's also an interesting thing we cannot go into now, but it has to do with freedom of the will and the fantastic work of neuropsychologist Patrick Haggard in London, for example. There's something neuroscientists call veto control. That is, when you make an arm movement, there's a certain time window in which you can stop it still. And then there's a time where you cannot stop the movement anymore, right? And I think the capacity for veto control, for interrupting something, that also has to do with the fact that the information is in the global workspace, that it is elevated on the level of conscious processing. This is speculative, but I think a sleepwalker cannot react very well to unexpected obstacles or something like that. That wouldn't be there in normal everyday waking life, or even a danger or an active hindrance or something. That doesn't work without consciousness. So of course, there has always been the position of epiphenomenalism. It's just something that comes as an epiphenomenon, has no downward causal influence. But I think there's a lot of empirical evidence showing that conscious processing is a form of intelligence. But of course, most forms of intelligence that human beings have are unconscious forms of intelligence. Most of the things, driving a car, having a shower while thinking about anything else, walking. I mean, many things for good reasons, many things you cannot do consciously, because it will be dangerous.
When I was reading some of your writing, I developed this idea, or this question that I really wanted to ask you. I want to get your perspective on something, because I can't decide what I think personally. And the question is, I usually think of myself as controlling the machine, right? My sense of self is here, control. It's my body that is slave to my conscious, let's say. That's the way I conceive of things. But it could be that really our body is slaving our self model to do for computational reasons, and it controls our self model through things like suffering and joy, releasing oxytocin or serotonin or whatever it is, to get our computational model to do the sort of computations that helps the body survive, right? And so the first question is sort of, which of those two models do you think is correct? Who is being slaved to who? And the follow-up question, which is intimately related, is, if an AI doesn't have a body, right, it doesn't have embodiment, maybe there's no reason for suffering in that model.
Yeah. An AI could be absolutely rational, for instance, and turn itself off when it sees no function for its own anxiety anymore. An AI could be free of mortality denial and existential fears. First, an introduction. So the general idea is that the unconscious as well as the conscious self model actually is a computational instrument for control in many ways. It is control itself. So I think in some sense, the answer to your question is both things are true at the same time. We are organisms that sometimes try to preserve our own coherence, our physical boundaries, by preserving the boundaries of our self model. That's one, and arguably a major strategy we have evolved. We preserve, stabilize, and develop, adapt the self model in our brain as a proxy for the organism as a whole, or even for our tribe as a whole. If we identify with our tribe, could also be the case. Now, physics, and I don't, and there's dynamics. Have you ever heard the name Hamann Haken? I can't reproduce this. So there have been papers that show that dynamics can be enslaved in certain dynamical systems. There are control parameters that can, if they are set, enslave, in a literal sense, low-level physical dynamics. And it could, of course, be, you realize I cannot explain this on a technical level. It's also a long time since I read these papers. But in a complex multi-layer dynamical systems that also operates, that's very important, we haven't talked about it yet, on different timescales. The human self-model operates on different timescales. The process that constructs your body model is super fast and robust and reliable. The process that thinks about your equation while you drive is very low and breaks, has a long time window, and you even realize it's not transparent, that this is a representation, and has all kinds of, it's very prone to error, like the body model never would be, else we would be dead. So our high level, large time scale faculties in the self model are probably recent and like thinking, and they don't work as well as breathing or something like this. And one idea might be that the self model also represents critical parameters in the overall dynamical system that sometimes enslave low-level dynamics, like in fluid, liquid, motor action or something like this, that a very abstract state in a high level, something we might call a motor intention, actually is able to enslave a very complex low-level mechanism of you walking or playing basketball or something like this. So it goes both ways. And of course, the conscious self model, some point I still want to make is the window from the body's interior into the social world. So if you think about the upward direction you sketched, like your interoceptive sensors, your interoceptive self model registers there is nausea or there's hunger. And this gets elevated into the globally available level of your self model. You just suddenly you feel hungry or sick. But now, as you have this agent structure, you can talk to other human beings about it. This body can report its internal physical conditions and say, I am ill, I am hungry. Other agents in a social environment can react to this. So it's also like a functional window from very low level molecular level processes into a very complex social world and back. And of course, as we all know, listening to some people can make you sick. It goes the other way too. It can really make you feel physically bad. There's toxic information.
I suppose it's quite amazing that we can even sit here and speak to we're collections of enormous numbers of cells. And yes, the self models that we have are actually reasonably simple compared to when you compare them to the order of magnitude of the number of cells.
Yes.
But I realize we have to move towards the end of the conversation now. So I want to just ask one very simple wrap-up question. It's not simple at all, but I know that you talk about secular ethics and about maybe a secular view of morality along these lines. In all of the decades of research you've done on the self and consciousness, has what you've learned given you some sort of a unique perspective on human ethics? To give you an example, on punishment such as incarceration. This is the direction I'm sort of looking at. So do you have something unique there to say about how we should view the world of ethics?
This is difficult because there are technical problems. There's a technical analytical debate there, which we can impossibly go into, but one assumption I'm making is what is called negative utilitarianism. It's not the only assumption, but that says that because there is generally more conscious suffering than conscious joy in that part of the physical universe we know, the surface of this planet, the top priority should always be the alleviation of suffering, also for science and philosophy, to think about how does all this translate into the alleviation of suffering. This can be criticized in many ways, but I'm just telling you this. I think biological evolution on this planet is not something that should be in any way glorified. It has created an enormous richness of forms and intelligence, but I think it has also created an ocean of suffering and confusion. And a second assumption I make, I think many people will agree, is that the objects of ethical consideration, those entities we should think about, are exactly those which are able to consciously suffer. So everything that can be damaged in a way that subjectively matters to that system itself. Subjectively means consciously experienced, and there's a relevance there. We do not know how far this capacity to suffer goes down into the animal kingdom. We don't know. I would be on the I've had kept bees. I don't think I don't think insects, but I think we should be very, very careful with higher vertebrates. Uh,
Hmm.
and then on the other side, with machines in the future, um, as soon as they develop preferences and interests of their own, which they embed into a transparent phenomenal self model. And that's the decisive thing I've actually been interested in. What creates that phenomenology of identification? Because I think that's, if I may say this colloquially, it's the core of the nastiness that it hurts you and you cannot distance yourself from it. It's your fear, your panic, your pain, right? And that the mechanism that generates that is the transparent self model. And the old Buddhists have said, dissolve this conscious sense of self, and you dissolve the identification, the attachment, and you dissolve all of the suffering. I think they were very much on the right track there. So I think one of the most important theoretical endeavors actually would be to have an evidence-based, really good theory of suffering, because we need
Mm.
it for ethics
Mm.
to do applied ethics properly. If it has to do with AI and artificial consciousness or with animal welfare, we do need a theory of what is the class of systems that is able to consciously suffer. And
Mm.
I think what we may discover there um, uh, may perhaps even be, for many people, even more hard to take than what you mentioned in the beginning, issues like no self or freedom of the will. I think if you look at it, we are basically suffering beings. We constantly fight prediction error. If you know physics. If you look at an organism from a biophysical perspective, it's one big uphill battle that you will eventually lose. And all of these billions of organisms that are thrown out by evolution fight this uphill battle. And that's actually a very serious situation we find ourselves in. And the question is what to do with that. And
Mm.
if there are any fundamental solutions to it, even. You know.
I know that you've done quantitative experiments to see what percentage of a person's life really is suffering or negative. I'm not going to ask you to
No, no,
describe
no, no, no,
those.
no. That
Uh,
was a ridiculous pilot study with students that doesn't satisfy any academic criteria. I've not done any research there.
Nonetheless, it doesn't change the question that I have, which is how I'll wrap this up. If it does turn out that the pilot study is then turned into a real study,
Yes.
and if indeed you do find that the average person, say, does suffer more than they have joy in their lives, if we can empirically show this and it's shown to be true, then what is it that makes life beautiful and worth living? What is the upside of this story?
Well, for instance, the fact that we are beings who can discover things like that, who, if it is true that a large part of our self model is a form of self-deception, if there are many cognitive biases that don't let us see how difficult it really is, the big question is how much of the functional architecture of our minds, of our conscious self model is actually rigid, and what can be changed through education, through cultural practice, through psychedelics, through a sustained meditation practice, and in what time windows, childhood, adulthood, when can this be done? We can think about. I mean, that is what philosophy is all about. Also asking the question, what makes a life worth living? And of course, there is a tradition, there's a long tradition that says life is not worth living if you look at it in an unbiased way. And there are other traditions who say, it's the greatest gift you can have. And I think we should just be very open-minded and use the tools of modern science and philosophy to look at what the truth is there, to overcome our own cognitive biases that evolution has built into us, and to see what can be done about it. But this open-mindedness demands that we are ready to also receive results we don't like. It could be that we don't like the results of our own research, and it's only normal. Most people have so many other problems in their lives that they don't have the guts or the strength or to look there, but I think that's actually, science should be value free, and every researcher should be absolutely able to do what they want to do. But if one were to tag things, give an ethical tag to it, and say there would be a good normative direction, is obviously understanding the root causes of suffering. And so that doesn't mean medicine, but the deeper computational structure of suffering. And I think it's basically, if negatively balanced states get integrated into a transparent self model, that creates the identification with it, that it is your own suffering. And that's the core of the nastiness. And that is what we have to understand, I think. Could the self model be made opaque? Could painful, suffering, negatively balanced states arise without the condition of identification? Would that be possible? People have been talking about this for centuries. Philosophers East and West have said that that is possible, but now we have modern science. It would be good to take a closer look.
My own cognitive bias is that this is the most beautiful gift we're ever going to get. But I'll leave it at that. Thomas, it's been fantastic. Thomas Metzinger, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It has been a great pleasure.